June 16, 1944. A 14-year-old boy, a rushed trial, an unjust execution. In 1944, George Stinney Jr. became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. But was he truly guilty? Or was he a victim of one of the greatest injustices in American history? Alcolu, South Carolina. A small, segregated mill town where black and white families lived in separate communities. Life here was simple, yet divided. It was in this town, on March 23rd, that two young girls set out on their bicycles, completely unaware of the tragedy that awaited them. Betty, 11, and Mary, 7, were last seen riding near the railroad tracks, picking flowers and chatting with people along the way. But that evening, they never returned home. The entire town searched for them. Then, the next morning, a gruesome discovery. Their bodies were found in a muddy ditch, brutally beaten, their skulls fractured. A railroad spike was believed to be the murder weapon. The town demanded justice. Within hours, police arrested 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. The reason? A witness claimed they saw him talking to the girls earlier that day. George was taken to the local jail. His parents were never allowed to see him. His family was threatened, forced to flee town, leaving him completely alone. He was interrogated for hours, alone, frightened, and defenseless. No lawyer, no parents, no protection. Authorities later claimed he confessed, but no written statement exists. Some say he was beaten until he said what they wanted to hear. And just like that, the case was closed. No investigation, no evidence, just the word of a terrified child. Less than a month after his arrest, George Stinney Jr. was put on trial for his life. A child, just 14 years old, stood before a courtroom that had already decided his fate. The courtroom was filled with white townspeople whispering among themselves. They weren't there to witness justice. They were there to see a conviction. To them, George Stinney was already guilty. The prosecution's case was built on a supposed confession, one that was never recorded, never signed, and never verified. George, who could barely read or write, had no way of defending himself. His words carried no weight. There were no fingerprints, no blood on his clothes, no murder weapon linking him to the crime, no solid evidence at all. But in 1944 South Carolina, the color of his skin was enough. George was given a court-appointed lawyer, Charles Plowden. But Plowden didn't argue for his client's innocence. The jury, 12 white men, sat in silence as the trial rushed forward. The judge didn't seem concerned with the details either. The entire courtroom felt like a performance, a scripted event leading to an inevitable conclusion. And then it was over. The jury didn't deliberate for hours, not even one. They took just 10 minutes to decide his fate. George sat in silence as the sentence was read. He didn't cry. He didn't beg for mercy. He simply clutched his Bible, the only thing he had left. His parents weren't there. They wanted to be, but they had been warned. If they stayed, if they fought for their son, they would be lynched. Fearing for their lives, they fled town, leaving George completely alone. There was no appeal. No chance to prove his innocence. From arrest to sentencing, just 81 days had passed. And now, a child waited for the day he would face the electric chair. June 16, 1944. Just 81 days after his arrest, George Stinney Jr. was led to the execution chamber. He had no final appeal, no last-minute intervention, only the certainty of what awaited him. He was 14 years old, barely 5 feet tall, weighing just 90 pounds. The electric chair was built for adults, far too large for his small frame. As the guards strapped him in, they realized his feet didn't touch the floor. His arms were too short for the restraints. They placed a Bible under him as a booster seat. As the black hood was lowered over his face, George remained silent. No last words, no plea for mercy. He had already been ignored too many times before. At 7:30 p.m., the switch was pulled. A surge of 5,380 volts of electricity tore through his body. His convulsions were violent, but the execution continued. 1 minute, 2 minutes, then silence. George Stinney Jr. was pronounced dead. There was no funeral, no burial with his family. His body was discarded in an unmarked grave. Decades later, the truth would surface. George was innocent, but by then, justice had come too late. For nearly 70 years, the story of George Stinney Jr. remained buried in history, another forgotten tragedy of the past. But time would not erase the injustice. Decades later, people began asking the question that should have been asked in 1944. Was George Stinney truly guilty? The evidence that had convicted him was non-existent. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no physical proof. Then, forensic experts re-examined the crime scene and found something shocking. The murder weapon was a 40-pound railroad spike. Could a 14-year-old boy, barely 90 pounds, have wielded such a weapon with enough force to crush 2 skulls? The answer was clear: no. As investigators dug deeper, the truth unraveled. George's so-called confession had never been written down. His trial had been a legal failure, and with no real evidence, the case against him collapsed. In 2014, nearly 70 years after his execution, a South Carolina judge overturned George Stinney's conviction. The ruling was clear. He had not received a fair trial. He had been innocent all along, but justice had come too late. George Stinney Jr. had been executed at 14 for a crime he did not commit. His name was finally cleared, but his story remained a haunting reminder of a system that had failed him. George Stinney Jr. was just a boy, forgotten by history for decades, but his story refused to disappear. Over the years, it inspired books, films, and discussions about justice, race, and the failures of the legal system. Justice delayed is justice denied. George Stinney Jr. was exonerated, but the truth came 70 years too late. He was a child, failed by a system meant to protect him. His story is not just about the past. It's a warning for the present and the future. How many more innocent people have suffered the same fate? How many are still waiting for justice? What do you think? Should the justice system be reformed? Should the death penalty still exist? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Turn on the notification bell, because you won't want to miss what's coming next.